Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So the theme for this month is a big one. What does it mean to be a people of liberation? Liberation, what a theme. Religions in general, and Unitarian Universalists in particular, have a history of being involved in movements of liberation. Liberating the mind, working to liberate people in the fight to end slavery, in universal education, in the franchise for women. This is an important story, this story of liberation, for us to recall if we want to be such a people. But that's not where my mind went. Instead, I started thinking about how is liberation relevant in religion today? How is religion helping to bring about liberation? Increasingly, Americans are not finding the answers for their lives in religious communities. Last fall, the Pew Research Center found that the number of Americans who check the unaffiliated box has increased by 10% over the last 7 years, now at 25% of the population. And nearly 40% of the youngest quintile of our demographic describe themselves as unaffiliated. They're called the nones. Looking at how religion is being used in the world today to justify unjustifiable violence, to demonize others, to advocate for hateful, divisive policies, it's no wonder that people, especially young people, are turning away from religion. Yet we also have to remember that religion served as such an important glue for so many liberation movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. So how do we, as a people, want to reclaim that uniting liberative praxis that is also possible in religion? While pondering this idea, I realized that my own commitment to religion and to the idea that it can be a force for liberation comes from my own personal experiences. Following that vein, I was thinking about those little liberation moments that I've experienced, those seemingly small events that in the end helped to shape my life. There's actually one particular event that came to mind. This one happened many years ago when my wife Lisa and I still lived in Minnesota. I was taking a loving kindness meditation class. And in these classes, you start by stilling the mind. And then you find something minor that you're not happy with yourself about and work to find forgiveness for yourself. And this then you develop through this practice of loving kindness, first for yourself, and then you make these larger circles to friends, to family, to acquaintances, to people you don't even know, to enemies, until it encompasses all of humanity. Easy enough. Our class met on Wednesday mornings at 7 o'clock. It was up on a second floor of a warehouse in the Uptown area of Minneapolis. This is before Uptown was a gentrified with-it neighborhood. This is when it was still pretty gritty. So we'd climb up these rickety stairs and go into this large, cold warehouse room with peeling paint and rough wood floors. We'd sit, wrap ourselves in blankets, and begin to try and still the mind. Now, it just so happened that 7:15 was when they collected garbage in the alley next to the building. So just as I think the mind's starting to settle, you'd hear these garbage trucks come rumbling down the alleyway. And then they'd stop. It seemed like right underneath my window. And you'd hear that hydraulic, you know, the sound. Then they'd move forward, pick up the bins, you know, the great big industrial bins of trash. And they'd lift it up, open up, and then start to shake it. And the glass and the metal falling into the garbage truck. Then you'd hear it whine, unceremoniously dumping the bin back on the ground, reclining with that last whine, and then take off, rumbling down the alleyway. I'm sitting there trying to still my mind. And I can't do it because of this terrible racket that these garbage trucks are making. My concentration was totally shot. And I'm thinking, how can I ever find loving kindness with all this noise? For several weeks, this intrusion would stymie my efforts. And I, of course, blamed the trash collectors. Then one fateful morning, mid-whine, I had this epiphany. Here I was, trying to find loving kindness for all of humanity, and I'm angry at the garbage collectors. It was like a bucket of cold water had dropped over my head. And I suddenly had this realization that they were not the obstacle, but they actually were my path. I knew that they were not this other trying to prevent me from achieving something. Instead, they were inextricably part of my universe, intimately tied to my life. Suddenly, my heart broke open, and it was like this cool breeze sweeping away the heat of anger. And I still remember that the irony of it brought this gentle smile across my face. And I thanked the garbage truck and those workers for unknowingly teaching me this most important lesson. So this simple experience was a moment of liberation for me. I realized how my own ego, my own sense of self-importance kept me from connecting, from experiencing that I was part of something more, inescapably so. And I could profoundly relate to Sharon Salzberg's thoughts about this idea of opening myself up to life. Writing about faith, Salzberg says that she doesn't rely on that conventional thought of trust and obey, that's not what faith is. Instead, faith is trusting our own bone-deep experiences, letting them show us our path to connection, our path to compassion. Salzberg's reflections on metta. Metta means benevolence. She speaks to a similar meditation practice that starts off with looking at those positive things that we've done and allowing those to help extend that positive sense to others. By trusting ourselves, by trusting the experiences of our lives, we can find that joyful liberation. The idea that we find such liberation within us goes all the way back to the teachings of the Buddha. Now remember that Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, he wasn't trying to start a religion. His goal was never to start something called Buddhism. He was trying to teach a path. Ultimately, the Buddha was a pragmatist. He would say to his students, try out what I'm teaching. If it works for you, great, keep doing it. If it doesn't, we'll try something different. He was not interested in creating a dogmatic description of ultimate truth, but instead, by using various methods, helping to teach people to reach nirvana, to reach liberation. So what is this idea, this nirvana that he was teaching? Well, there are two different aspects to nirvana. One is the idea of being liberated from the cycles of rebirth, ending that cycle of reincarnation. This is called parinirvana. That happens after one who's achieved nirvana dies and is not then reborn. Now, the other type of nirvana is removing those conditions that cause suffering in this life. This could be living as an enlightened being, or it could be experiencing those little moments, brief as they may be, those moments when we get it. It might not be a permanent state, but they can become guiding moments for our lives. This second type of nirvana is what most teachers focus on today. So how do we then develop and experience these nirvana moments? There are two kind of primary methods. The first, the Dalai Lama does a nice job of describing. When talking about the goals of spiritual practice, the Dalai Lama talks about the idea of happiness. Now, by happiness, he's not talking about big, giddy smiles, some unsustainable joy. This version of happiness is the kind of thing that too often causes us to chase after things that don't work. Instead, it's really that sense of contentment, of centeredness, of being liberated from that drive to prove oneself, to prove that you're better than another, to accumulate stuff or dollar signs to prove your worth. Now, in discussing happiness, the Dalai Lama starts with the idea of developing compassion, saying the more we care for the happiness of others, the greater is our own sense of well-being. Everyone, he says, is born with that seed of compassion. And then we can develop it and extend it in those larger circles to encompass all beings. Those enlightenment moments occur when we act from a place of compassion instead of ego. And those actions that we have will deeply then connect us to others and show us reality as it actually is, breaking through that sense of isolation. And so the Dalai Lama starts with compassion and says that if we act compassionately, if we follow that guide, then we develop this understanding, this sense of wisdom that shows how we are connected to everything. We may say that our first UU principle, that idea to promote and affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people, reflects that idea. But we don't really bone deep know it. We don't really bone deep have that faith until we've experienced it by extending that compassion for others. Now, the second method is taught by Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, unlike the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh starts with wisdom. He encourages us to look deeply into reality, to see everything as it is, to understand that reality is constantly changing, that nothing is permanent. For example, he bids us to look at a cloud. And so we look at this cloud, and we give it this name, and we have this thought that it's something very permanent. And then it dissipates and disappears, as though it never actually was. But he bids us to look deeper, and we will see the cloud. We'll see the cloud in the mist. We'll see the cloud in the rain. We'll see the cloud in the leaves and the grass that the rain nurtures. The same is true of all things. We give things names. We give them labels. We give them identities as though they would exist forever. Yet they all change. And when time proves us wrong, we're often bereft with grief or anger or disappointment. Thich Nhat Hanh's nickname, they says, when we look deeply, we will know that everything is changing and that reality is ultimately interconnected through this change. He said, when we know that, we know then that nothing is born, nothing dies, but all continues on the altering paths of reality. This mindful attention to reality as it passes then can't help but lead us to a sense of compassion. Since we know, just as the student in my story experienced, we realize that we're all on this journey together. And so we have these two paths. One says by acting compassionately, we realize how interdependent we all are, and that brings us liberation from those causes of suffering. The other says if we look deeply into reality as it is and understand its impermanence and the way that things are always changing, that will then arouse this sense of compassion. And this sense of compassion, this deep feeling of interconnection for all beings, is nirvana. So this is then one of the paradoxes I find in the Buddha's teachings. On the side of wisdom, the Buddha says we're all nothing, because everything's constantly changing. Everything's impermanent. And our desire to be something is what causes suffering. On the other hand, we have that practice of compassion that says we're all everything, that our connections to others' suffering and to our own helps us to know compassion. And just as knowing that young monk across the table was also a worthy human being and not my opponent. So compassion then helps us to know that by loving all beings so completely, we then experience that radical interconnectedness, that sense of being one with all instead of separate. What we call the interdependent web of life. And so wisdom and compassion are tools to liberate us from our own sense of smallness and help us to understand and experience that interdependent web. The idea of impermanence is sometimes described as being fatalistic. When we're facing the struggles in life, the loss of a loved one, the uncertainties of our times, saying, oh, it's all just change, provides very little comfort. But this is not meant to be a dismissal of those emotions. It merely asks us to remember that there's more as well. Thich Nhat Hanh is absolutely not a fatalist, as you could hear in that poem. Even though his life was torn apart by war and exile from Vietnam, he still found that beauty in the world that his poem describes. For him, the idea of walking on water is no miracle, but the fact that we get to walk on this earth, that is a miracle to inspire awe. I was glad I had a chance to share my favorite little Zen story this morning. I do tell that every semester when I'm teaching Buddhism at Iowa State. And every time there's the same reaction. When I start the story, the students are doodling in their notebooks or reading the paper or surreptitiously looking at their cell phones until I get to the part about the sword. Then they look up. And just as the Zen master had the students' attention, so too do I have my students' attention. There's something very profound, even in a story, about that reminder of our own mortality. Even though we know it's the reality that we're born into, we still have this sense of denial. In the story of our lives, when we're confronted with that reality, with that fact, we take note. And so, too, in the story of the chess game, as the student's attention is awoken at that moment. Now, Sharon Salzberg's discussion of metta then takes on the second act of the chess game, when we realize that we share this mortal life with all beings. That is that profound aha moment. When we don't just intellectually know it, but we know it in our very bodies. Just as the student was liberated from his own egoism, from his own sense of isolation, probably feeling for the first time in his life that he was so connected to another being, and knowing that his actions would have a profound effect on that other being's life. He taps deep within himself to that spot of compassion, that kindness for another, and finding there compassion for the young man sitting across from him. So big liberation movements, those big liberation movements start with these little liberation moments. It's from those moments that we build the connection, the desire, the drive to help find that liberation for all. The Buddha believed that if we knew this experience of nirvana, we would no longer treat people as other. Even though his teachings focused on individual transformation, his hopes were much larger. He taught that this liberation would lead to a liberation from the caste structure and lead liberation from oppressive patriarchy. So being a people of liberation means that in the eyes of our loved ones, we see that preciousness of life. In the joys and the sorrows we experience, we know we're on a common road with everyone, and allow them to help lead us to have compassion for everyone. It means that our actions bear witness to the possibility for all people, standing on the side of peace and love and understanding. And so it was for a very different monk who was sitting in his hall when a big samurai came bursting through the door. The samurai stood before the monk and barked at him and said, "Monk, teach me about heaven and hell." And the monk looked up from where he was sitting in meditation. He looked up at this mighty warrior and gave him a look of utter disdain. He said, "Teach you about heaven and hell? I couldn't teach you about anything. You're noisy and dumb and dirty. You're a disgrace. You're an embarrassment to the samurai class. Get out of my sight. I can't stand you." The samurai got furious. He drew his sword and lifted it above his head, ready to slay the monk. Looking straight into the samurai's eyes, the monk said softly, "That is hell." The samurai froze, realizing the compassion of the monk who risked his own life in order to show him what hell was. He put down his sword and fell to his knees in gratitude. And the monk said softly, "And that is heaven." May we all find in our own lives that chance to experience it as it flows before us, and find there the possibility of liberation, the possibility of a heaven on earth. May it be so.